Welcome, my name's Dr. Jason W. Morrison and I'm a theologist from New South Wales, Australia. Psychologists help people with themselves and other people, and theologists help people with themselves and God. Welcome everybody, and thank you for watching. Dr. Jason W. Morrison, theologist, New South Wales, Australia. I want to go to my favourite passage, favourite in the sense that I think it's time that the invisible evils of religion come out of the closet. I've just got this a little bit too big. There we are. Romans chapter 7 is the one that really nails it for those that are interested in what causes a lot of religious harm and evil and even maiming. Paul's talking about the Mosaic law and how it arouses our sinful, evil nature, and it does it so easily and so gently. It makes evil seem attractive, our sinful nature that works within us, and it only needs a drop or two of the law to begin to be aroused within our nature and to begin to overcome and dominate our good intentions that we want to live by and experience. He says, my brethren, now just before I go any further, I want to mention that the Western people were never under the law. We were never designed or invited to be under the Mosaic law. We have been adopted in through the finished work of the Lord Jesus Christ to a life of faith in the finished work of what Christ has done. But unfortunately, Westerners come into this Christian life and then begin to automatically think that there is something they need to do or not do to make God happy or stop him from being sad, or in other words, keep commandments. Whether they be personal or Mosaic, they're both going to have the same consequential result outside of the command that Jesus gave us, which was to love our neighbour as ourselves, or in other words, look after yourself, and then you'll be able to get along with people a lot better. Or look after yourself and look after those around you. There's many ways you can describe the love your neighbour as yourself command. But Paul says, and he's speaking to Jews, you have also become dead to the law through the body of Christ. In other words, when Christ died on the cross, his finished work has now made the law not a requirement for an approach to God. The requirements of the law are now dead through the finished work of Christ, and it was through faith in Christ that we now approach God. Not only the Jews, but also the Gentiles. But it was very difficult for the Jews to transition from the law and leave it behind and just live by faith in the finished work of Christ, because there was millenniums, there was generations that tried to live that way. And he says that you may be married to another, to him who was raised from the dead. So we see that Jesus was raised from the dead, that we should bear fruit to God. So the ability to bear fruit in the Christian life in a complete and healthy way, uninterrupted way, is to become dead to the things that we think we need to do or not do through the finished work of Christ, to make God happy or stop him from being sad. Now, there's some very serious reasons for this, and this is my whole concern. When we were in the flesh, now the flesh is not talking about our physical body, it's talking about being under the law, and it's addressed to Jews, Jewish believers. The passions, the sinful, evil, horrible passions, the evil that is within us, and in this case specifically the Jews who are under the law, or anybody else that wants to put themselves under the law more generally, were aroused by the law. Now, this is not just a general brush over statement in the Bible. This is a very serious clue as to where religious evil and sin and crime and harm originates and manifests from. Our sinful passions are aroused by the things we think we need to do or not do to make God happy or stop him from being sad. And you cannot recognize this happening usually in somebody until it's too late. And this will be at work in our members trying to bear fruit to death. So when we think there's something we need to do or not do to make God happy or stop him from being sad, we're really, whether we believe it or not, even though it might look good on the surface, underneath we're bearing fruit to death. But now we have been delivered from the law, but from the things we think we need to do or not do to make God happy or stop him from being sad, having died to what we have held by, so that we should serve in the newness of the Spirit, in the freeness of the Spirit, and not in the oldness of the letter. And it goes on and on and on and on. And there's many other letters that allude to this written by Paul. Now, we're going to go to a story I've found, and we'll work through it and see where we end up with this one.
What could turn an ordinary, unassuming man into a monster? Since his arrest in February...
Now, what could turn an ordinary, unassuming man into a crazed serial killer? Now, they're asking the question, but they don't seem to be able to find it. This will be very interesting how this one works out. Now, get yourself comfortable, get some biscuits or some chips or something. Let's see how this ends up. This is the story of Dennis Rader, the serial killer.
Many around the world have wondered how a soft-spoken family man named Dennis Rader became the murderer who identified himself by 3 initials, BTK, for bind, torture, and kill. He stalked America's heartland for over 30 years, leaving a trail of bodies and many clues. Now the pieces are finally coming together. His arrest led to a shocking confession and the first detailed glimpse inside the mind of a man who called himself a monster. Tonight, for the first time, you will learn how and why Dennis Rader was driven to commit his murders as the BTK killer. You'll hear from some of the friends and neighbors he deceived, the police he taunted, and our exclusive interviews with 2 women Rader stalked, yet who managed to survive. Finally, forensic psychologists will examine the life of Dennis Rader to explain what drove him and what haunted him. As tonight, the killer speaks.
Now, just while this is warming up, he was a family man. They couldn't work out what was going on. Here we go. This is Dennis.
And that might be several of them, but you really home in on that person. They basically become that's the victim.
When Dennis Rader speaks, he doesn't sound like a monster. That is what is so chilling. To him, murder is just a job.
I had many, what I call them projects. There were different people in the town that I followed, watched.
One of his projects was a woman named Shirley Vian, murdered on March 17th, 1977.
Got her a glass of water, comforted her a little bit, and then went ahead and tied her up, and then put a bag over her head and strangled her.
Another project, Marine Hedge, April 27th, 1985.
She was already dead, so I took pictures of her in different forms of bondage.
And so it went, project after project, victim after victim, 10 altogether over 30 years. Only recently has the full scope of Dennis Rader's rampage of death come into focus.
Please rise.
On June 27, 2005, Rader stood in the courtroom of Judge Gregory Waller and confessed.
What did you do then?
Strangled her.
He is the notorious BTK serial killer who terrorized Wichita, Kansas for 3 decades.
You were engaged in some kind of fantasy during this period of time?
Yes, sir.
All right. Now, when you use the term fantasy, is this something you were doing for your personal pleasure?
Sexual fantasy, sir.
I see.
Friends and neighbors were stunned. This was not the Dennis Rader they knew. He was happily married for over 30 years.
Now take very careful notice of this. He was happily married for over 30 years. Obviously, the wife never had a clue what was going on underneath the surface.
2 grown children, a church leader, active.
Mr. Rader was a church leader. Mr. Rader was a church leader.
in Boy Scouts.
So what did he think he needed to do or not do to make God happy or stop him from being sad? What was Dennis Rader's theology within his core?
In suburban Wichita, enforcing rules about things like unleashed pets and how high your grass could grow.
We've been tracking it down. The dogs.
He even talked about it in a local TV interview in 2001. But there is another Dennis Rader, hidden behind that calm facade.
Inside he was BTK, and Dennis Rader was the mask of sanity he wore. He probably thought the rest of us were fools for not recognizing him for the monster he was.
Rader has begun to reveal more. After his court testimony, he made a phone call from jail to reporter Larry Hatteberg of Wichita station KAKE. Hatteberg has covered the BTK story from the beginning.
I said, but you were so cold inside the courtroom when you were recounting these murders, so very cold, and that stunned everybody. He said, well, I was just trying to get it out.
Hatteberg taped the call. The sound quality is poor, but the implications clear.
The only thing I can figure out is I'm compartmentalized somewhere in my body. I can do those sort of things and go back to normal life, which is unbelievable.
So there's no mention of a sinful nature and how that works through our Christian beliefs, our wrong Christian beliefs. Let's see if the experts mention this at all.
Killed to gratify himself. He had no personal animosity towards any of the people that he killed. These were simply events, or what he called projects, that he was able to relieve himself sexually and to gratify himself.
Why wasn't he sexually gratified at home? Some religious people think that they don't or ought not to have sex with their wives as a matter of religious cleanliness or religious respect or a way of caring. So they take it outside the home and deal with it out there with prostitutes and all the rest of it. I mean, there's some twisted idealisms out there, and we just got a emergency vehicle of some kind. What is it? An ambulance.
His first killings offer some clues and set the tone for his terror to come. It began on January 15th, 1974. Dennis Rader killed his first 4 victims: Joseph Otero, his wife Julie, their 11-year-old daughter Josephine, and 9-year-old son Joseph Jr. His method? Strangulation.
I had never strangled anyone before, so I really didn't know how much pressure you had to put on a person or how long it would take.
Rader strangled his victims primarily because he wanted to have complete control over their course of death. To someone like Rader, to be able to control life and death itself is what is stimulating to him.
First of all, Mr. Otero was strangled, or a bag put over his head and strangled. Then I thought he was going down, and I went over and strangled Mrs. Otero, and I thought she was down. Then I strangled Josephine, while she was down, and then I went over to Junior and put the bag on his head.
You can't describe the terror or the anguish that was going through them when he was killing them. I mean, he left out those details.
Josephine had woke back up.
What did you do then?
And I took her to the basement and eventually hung her.
Charlie Otero found the bodies of his family when he came home from school.
It hit me instantly. The minute I saw my father, I knew he was dead, and when I saw his face with his cut tongue and the belt around his neck, the horror you could smell the horror and the fear and the death in the house, and it just never left me.
Serial killers don't wake up one day and decide that they would go out and kill a woman. That sounds like a good idea. It doesn't work that way. It begins 10, 15, 20 years earlier in the offender's mind, in his fantasies.
Those fantasies took root in an ordinary and unremarkable place. Rader was born in Pittsburgh, Kansas, on March 9th.
Right, here's some behind-the-scenes details on this man.
1945. The oldest of 4 sons of William and Dorothea Rader. The family moved to Wichita when his father, a former Marine, went to work for a gas company. Friends say there never appeared to be anything.
Let me just say his father was a former Marine, which can hint towards a very regimented house, which is very difficult to live under. I don't know if any of the listeners have lived with an ex-serviceman, but they're trained to have things done properly and consistently. And it's very difficult for the normal civil person to try and keep up with the expectations of the ways of a serviceman, because they're disciplined and they expect that discipline to be in those that are around them. So they try and enforce it, and they wear people out. They wear their families out. And of course you get breakdowns and separations and all sorts of drama.
Nothing unusual about young Dennis or his family relationships.
I'll never believe that he was abused in any way as a child. I've never saw him being abusive to anybody else or to animals and this kind of stuff.
Things have had to have happened to Dennis Rader during his lifetime to where the ultimate pleasure is somebody else's suffering, somebody else's terror.
And Rader admitted his sadistic fantasies to reporter Hetteberg.
I asked him if he knew growing up that there was something wrong with him, and he said as early as elementary school he knew that there was a problem.
And what kind of problems were those? All sexual fantasies.
He was surprised that no one caught it, that no one noticed that there was something different about Dennis Rader, even in grade school.
It was the beginning of Dennis Rader's secret life, and he continued to hide it from everyone at Wichita Heights High School.
The thing that really stands out about Dennis is the fact that Dennis never really stood out.
The invisible man. 99% of the time that I saw him, his mind was 1,000 miles away. Now, I had never saw him laugh, and that's one of the things that sort of stuck with me. You know, no sense of humor.
Rader joined the Air Force in 1966 and was stationed in Europe and Japan. He reached the rank of sergeant and repaired communication systems. He was even awarded the Good Conduct Medal. He returned to Wichita in 1970.
Dennis went to be a serviceman like his dad, so he would have been regimented and had certain particular expectations as well.
And the following year married Paula Dietz, who was working as a secretary at the VA hospital. He took a job at the Coleman Company in 1972. One of his co-workers was also his first victim, Julie Otero.
It exploded on January 15th, 1974. That's when the volcano exploded.
You know what it was that caused you to reach that point?
I don't
Now
think...
remember, this guy was a practicing Lutheran, a practicing church person. Now, they're not bringing this into the psychology of what's going on here. Like behind the scenes, this man's going to church and everything.
think he can answer the question as to why he stepped across the line and actually committed the murders. He had thought about it a great deal. He mentioned that in his confessions, that he had fantasized a great deal.
and that he had specific fantasies about Mrs. Otero and about Josephine, the daughter of the Oteros.
And he knew there would be more victims to come. The man once considered invisible was about to make his mark on the world. Next, Dennis Rader describes the inner demons that made him kill.
Probably referring to his sinful nature.
First of all, Mr. Otero was strangled, a bag put over his head and strangled.
What sort of a madman could have committed such a ruthless crime as the Otero killings? In the fall of 1974, no one would have imagined that murderer to be Dennis Rader. Not long after that quadruple homicide, a crime that stunned and terrified Wichita, Rader and his wife Paula were expecting their first child. They seemed the picture of marital bliss. But when someone else was arrested for the Otero murders, Dennis Rader wrote a letter to the local newspaper taking credit for the killings. "I did it by myself and no one's help," he wrote. To prove it, he described every lurid detail of the crime scene.
The two things that drove this guy always were his sadistic sexual fantasies and his extreme savage narcissism. He had to get credit.
He has an incredibly grandiose sense of self-esteem to compensate for what he really is, which is actually a nobody. And so in his mind, he wants to be famous. He wants to be world famous.
In a chilling postscript, he even gave himself a title, BTK, bind them, torture them, kill them. And then he said he'll strike again. When this monster enter my brain, I will never know. I can't stop it, so the monster goes on.
He doesn't understand what it is that causes him to kill.
Guess what the monster is? Our sinful, evil nature, of which the Bible talks about. Now remember, this man was a practicing Lutheran, somewhat high in his local church. And I believe that this has some kind of connection to why this man turned out the way he did. He lived with a military father, so he would have been under the demands that come with that. He became military himself, which would have given him a mindset that most civil people cannot live up to or attain or live under at that fact. And then combined with his Christianity, I wonder what he thought he needed to do or not do to make God happy or stop him from being sad.
For years, he's called it Factor X. He said Factor X was the same thing that Son of Sam had. Factor X was the same thing that Jack the Ripper had. And
Factor X is the same thing we all have, our sinful, evil nature. But we don't want to look at it, we don't want to discuss it, because it's humiliating to think that we all have the capability of performing evil.
And he had it too.
Rader called it his little friend.
I personally think it's I know this is not very Christian, but I actually think it's a demon.
And
I don't think it's very Christian, but I actually think it's a demon. Well, I wonder if he was aware of his sinful nature. Demons will use our sinful, evil nature, but there's no mention of that yet.
And it turns out that it was this frog-like demon thing that he's drawn in his mind. So what he is saying, basically, is the demon was with him during the murders.
The monster was just, I think, part of his rationalization. He could blame something for what he was doing.
It was an excuse he would need to use more frequently.
See, that's an interesting point, that he wanted to blame something for what he was doing. But see, this is where religion's not doing its job. This is where Christianity, in most cases, isn't doing its job, because it's not teaching those that are in it or coming into it that we have a sinful nature, that it's aroused and empowered by the things we think we need to do or not do to make God happy or stop him from being sad, and that all that is necessary, all that is required from us within Christianity is to believe in the finished work of the Lord Jesus Christ, that he was crucified, buried, and rose from the dead 3 days later, and that all our issues between ourselves and God was settled at the cross, that we are now filled with the Spirit, and that we can get on and live our lives. But religion just keeps wanting you there, and it won't let you go.
Was now he was constantly on the lookout for other victims.
I had many, what I call them projects. They were different people in the town that I followed, watched. Kathleen Bright was one of the next targets.
Now, just let me say, this guy was a family man, married family Christian man.
Like Julie Otero, 21-year-old Catherine Bright worked at the Coleman Company.
I was just driving by one day and I saw her go in the house with somebody else, and I thought that's a possibility. If you read much about serial killers, they go through what they call the different phases. That's one of the phases they go through as a trolling stage. Basically, you're looking for a victim at that time. And you could be trolling for months or years. But once you lock in on a certain person, then you become stalking.
BTK enjoyed the finding of a victim and the stalking of a victim. He references that in the letters, that's part of the thrill for him, is the stalking and the lying in wait.
The fact that he stalked his victims and had them under surveillance goes to his personality, his compulsive, detailed personality. He wasn't going to leave anything to chance.
Rader was what we called an organized killer. This is an individual who put a lot of time and effort into the selection of his victims, into the locations where he was going to assault, into the materials he was going to need for the crimes and the weapons he was going to need.
Wearing gloves and carrying 2 guns, Rader broke into Catherine Bright's house on April 4th, 1974. As he waited for her to come home, he believed he had everything under control. But Catherine arrived with her younger brother, Kevin.
I wasn't expecting him to be there.
Kevin Bright told me when he and his sister walked in, the person stepped out of the bedroom and said, "Hold it right there."
And he took control. He was, I don't know, it's like, he'd done it before.
There was just no doubt in Kevin's mind that this person was going to do whatever it was he came to do.
He had me tie my sister up, and then he tied me up in separate bedrooms.
The BTK series of murders, to me, appeared to be about control. I can control these people. I can control not only that they're going to die, but I can control how they're going to die and when they're going to die.
He came in and had a stalking, and he started strangling me then.
When I started strangling, either the variant broke or he broke his bonds and he jumped up real quick like. I pulled my gun and quickly shot him, hit him in the head. He fell over. I could see the blood.
Despite his meticulous planning, Rader hadn't been completely prepared.
He had not brought his murder kit, what he called his hit kit, so he didn't bring his own bindings and things of that nature.
If I had brought my stuff and used my stuff, Kevin would probably be dead today. I'm not bragging on that, it's just a matter of fact.
Rader shot him a second time in the face, but Kevin managed to escape. His sister wasn't as lucky.
Went back to finish the job on Catherine, and she was fighting. I was basically losing control. The strangulation wasn't working on her, and I used a knife on her.
He stabbed her 3 times. The perfectionist in Rader was not pleased with his handiwork.
Well, it was a total mess, because I didn't have control on it.
Not surprisingly, it was the only one of Rader's 10 murders that he never bragged about to police.
He never actually took credit. He said there was another victim, but he never actually told us who that victim was.
Rader learned from his mistakes. He would never again do without his murder kit. And from then on, he had another advantage, a thorough knowledge of security systems. He went to work at ADT Security Services in November of 1974 and learned how to outsmart household alarm systems.
For years, Dennis Rader installed home security systems to protect people from BTK. Just unbelievable.
At the ADT office, the killer was a gentleman.
He was very protective of me. When I started working in his area, I guess, so to speak, he made sure that the guys didn't tell dirty jokes around me. And, gosh, I mean, he was very good to me. Very good to me.
Those who knew him never had a clue about the other side of Dennis Rader.
He is a sexual sadist.
In 1977, 32-year-old Dennis Rader was leading a seemingly quiet life with his wife Paula and 2-year-old son Brian in Park City, Kansas. He regularly attended church and worked at ADT Security Services. He was considered by some co-workers to be the ideal company man. But there was another hidden Dennis Rader, a man haunted by monsters who he says drove him to kill again and again and again. He had already taken the lives of 5 people in his community, including 2 children.
He felt he was a secret agent living among us, keeping his BTK identity hidden, but with the cloak of Dennis Rader.
Now remember, this guy's a family man. He's a Christian, active in the church. They're leaving this bit out.
Rader blended in so well that he'd been stalking a couple of women for months without being noticed. The women shared a house on Hydraulic Avenue. They were to be his next project. In an exclusive interview, they recalled their close encounter with the BTK killer.
There was someone walking up in the flower bed, crunching on the leaves.
We just thought we had a prowler. It never entered our mind that it was a BTK.
But it was BTK. And on March 17th, Dennis Rader was ready to move in on them. He was on his lunch break from work at ADT, but going about the business of BTK. At 11:45, he walked down South Hydraulic Avenue toward the house where the women lived. He carried a small bag containing BTK's hit kit. But when Rader knocked on the door, certain that one of the women would be at home, there was no answer, and he now looked for another random target.
I was all keyed up, so I just started walking down Hydraulic. Met a young boy and asked him if he ID some pictures.
10 minutes later, Rader forced his way into the house where the boy's ill mother, Shirley Vian, was home with another son and a daughter. Rader pulled a gun and told Shirley to put toys and blankets in the bathroom where he barricaded the children. He then ordered her to disrobe.
I told Miss Vian that I had a problem with sexual fantasies. She got sick, threw up, got her a glass of water, comforted her a little bit, and then went ahead and tied her up, and then put a bag over her head and strangled her.
Suffocating his victims with a plastic bag became a regular part of his ritual of death.
To this individual, that was sexually stimulating to watch them suffer, to put them through the torture. You got to remember, he picked that name: bind, torture, and kill.
In what would become another signature of BTK, he masturbated into Shirley Vian's panties and left them next to her body before he fled.
The ultimate sexual stimulation.
Now, to me, this to me has dysfunctional theological undertones.
And climax for Dennis Rader was after the fact. When they were dead, that's when he would fantasize about them and masturbate over their bodies.
With another project behind him, Rader calmly went back to work that afternoon and then home to his wife and son. His small family was growing. The Raders would have a second child, a daughter named Carrie. But having a family of his own never aroused any feelings of compassion for his victims. The police were now convinced they were dealing with a serial killer and formed a special task force known as the Hot Dog Squad to study every aspect of these baffling cases. They even...
Now, do you think they would have picked that this man could be religious? Probably not.
Investigated themselves, believing that BTK had some connection to law enforcement. It was a good guess, since Dennis Rader was studying criminal justice at Wichita State University, where his courses covered serial killers, sex crimes, and criminal investigation.
He was really planning on how to perpetrate crimes and elude law enforcement.
And Rader...
So he wasn't learning how to stop crime and be a good law enforcer. He was learning how to be smart at crime and outsmart the law.
Was about to strike again. He had not given up on the roommates on Hydraulic Avenue.
When you think about it, the man's in rebellion of what the demands of society are. He's slipped into a deviancy that is motivated and strengthened by being able to dodge what is right.
And returned to their house one cold winter evening. He knocked on the back door.
We said, "Who are you? What do you want?" And he said, "I'm looking for Denise," which of course is the female for Dennis. And we said, "There's no one here by that name, and we're calling the police."
It was a close call for Rader, who managed to evade capture, even though he'd parked his car on a sheet of ice.
His car got stuck in the alley behind the house, and they could have caught him. They could have caught him right then.
The missed opportunity was costly. By the following winter, Rader, driven by his sexual fantasies, was in the throes of another compulsion to kill. He honed in on 25-year-old Nancy Jo Fox, who worked at a jewelry store in the Wichita Mall. On December 8th, Dennis Rader was lying in wait for Nancy. He cut her phone lines and broke into her house through a window and hid in a bedroom closet. Nancy arrived home sometime around 9:30. She turned on the lights and sat down to have a cigarette in the kitchen. At that moment, Dennis Rader stepped out from her closet.
I told her there I was I had a problem, sexual problem, that I would have to tie her up and have sex with her. She was a little upset. We talked for a while. She smoked a cigarette.
Nancy asked to go to the bathroom, and Rader told her to undress.
I handcuffed her, had her lay on the bed, and then I tied her feet. I think I had a belt. I took the belt and then strangled her with a belt at that time.
But then Rader removed the belt, only to tie pantyhose around Nancy's neck. Most of BTK's strangulation victims had multiple bruising on their necks, chilling evidence of his insatiable need to make his victims suffer.
As the woman began to die, he released his grip so that she could recover and so that he could strangle her again and prolong the period of her death, and by virtue of that increase the length of time in which he's stimulated sexually by doing this.
Dennis Rader did not sexually assault Nancy Fox, but as with other victims, he masturbated on a negligee near her body.
He really never sexually penetrated any of his victims. The violence took the place of it.
Rader also took some souvenirs from Nancy's home. Taking objects from a victim is a common practice among serial killers.
He could bring out these items and look at them as a way of re-stimulating himself.
But he also needed the thrill of taunting the police by
It's horrible, isn't it? It's horrible.
letting them know he'd pulled off another project. When he left Nancy's apartment, he reported the murder himself. For the first time, BTK's voice was heard.
You will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing, Nancy Fox.
I'm sorry, sir, I can't understand you. What is the address?
843 South Pershing. That is correct.
We thought it was certainly an arrogant, brazen kind of thing to do, a feeling of invincibility on his part.
Rader continued his cat-and-mouse game in January of 1978 with a poem sent to the Wichita Eagle on an index card. It was turned over to the police when BTK mentioned it in a package he sent to KAKE-TV on February 10th. The package contained graphic descriptions of the Otero, Payan, and Fox murders, along with a poem titled, "Oh Death to Nancy." There was also a letter warning that the killing was not going to stop. It was signed BTK. This communication now forced the police chief to announce to Wichita that a serial killer was at large and threatening to strike again. Rader got the recognition he craved, and the city was gripped with fear.
People have often talked about how this community changed once knowledge of BTK became public.
Can you imagine how when somebody in a church somebody well known and well respected, when they get caught like this, what it does to the church community as well. The impacts and the ripple effects are enormous.
Dennis Rader did that single-handedly.
But BTK didn't surface again until a year later. April 1979. Rader waited for 63-year-old Anna Williams inside her house at 615 South Pinecrest.
Fortunately, she didn't come home that night, but he laid in wait for her, and then subsequently sent a letter to her with some personal items in it to prove that he had in fact been in her house.
The letter, which was photocopied many times over to distort its origin, was analyzed by Arlen Smith and other investigators. They were ultimately able to trace it to one IBM copier on the campus of Wichita State University.
To my knowledge, that's the first time that we had really cemented the connection of the Wichita State University campus to the case.
In May of 1979, 34-year-old Dennis Rader graduated from Wichita State University with a Bachelor of Science degree in Administration of Criminal Justice. As the BTK killer, he had now gotten away with murder 7 times in less than 4 years. For the next 6 years, Rader would retreat into his life as an ordinary citizen and devoted family man. He would even become a Boy Scout leader. Eventually, he got to wear another kind of uniform in a new job that he loved. He became a local compliance officer in charge of animal control and preventing general nuisances in the community. But the monster inside of him could not be controlled, and it was only a matter of time before BTK would kill again. It was April of 1985. It had been 8 years since BTK strangled Nancy Fox in her bedroom. Wichita residents hoped the killer might already be in jail, or better yet, dead. But the horrible truth was that BTK was alive and well, and living among them as Dennis Rader. The monster was growing and evolving.
He had, at this point, a lot of comfort in killing, and he wanted to act out another fantasy, which entailed, in these cases, moving the bodies and taking them somewhere else.
What nobody knew was that BTK had found his next victim, his next project. Her name was Maureen Hedge, a woman who lived just a few houses away from him. In the past, BTK strangled victims with rope, pantyhose, and plastic bags. But with Maureen, he heightened the killing pleasure by using his bare hands.
And that's what produced the pleasure for BTK.
His key thing was he had a fantasy. Each time, fantasy was a little different.
When Maureen was dead, he took his bizarre killing style to a grotesque new level.
Eventually moved her to the trunk of the car. Took the car over to Christ Lutheran Church. This is with the older church. And
took her to the church. Now here we go. Here's a big connection.
I took some pictures of her.
In the very same church where he routinely attended Sunday services.
He routinely attended Sunday services, viewers. What was the theology inside his head? Did he think that he wasn't making God happy or stopping him from being sad? And this was causing the defeatism. The failure of that was causing him not only to punish himself, but murder others.
Where he would later be elected president of the church council.
President of the church council, a serial killer. This is how out of touch Christianity can be.
Dennis Rader tied Maureen in bondage
gracious.
positions and took Polaroid pictures of her.
I think he was ridiculing the members of Christ Lutheran Church by bringing this body in there. And I think he's secretly been laughing at them all along.
At the time he killed his neighbor, Dennis Rader was 40 years old. He had a wife and 2 kids. For most of the 11 years he had been killing, he had worked at the ADT security firm. As installation manager, Rader had easy access to security records of Wichita homeowners.
The central station was located in Wichita, so he could have easily looked up anybody if he wanted to. He had access to all the ADT customers. in Wichita.
One day, during his lunch hour, Rader strangled Vicki Wegerle while her 2-year-old son cried on the floor.
From what I gathered, this murder happened during the day over a lunch period. And evidently changed his clothes and put on his hit clothes. And I guess, committed this murder and evidently came back to work. He's the same Dennis that left.
This unique ability to switch gears and put on a different face was a key element of Dennis Rader's sociopathic personality.
He was able to pigeonhole things very well, categorize things according to what he refers to as his world. I think the man's very capable of very sincerely feeling love and concern for his wife and his children and his family. But he can't have those same feelings for others. His victims are objects of his pleasure.
While brutally killing
They're objects of his evil.
his neighbors, Rader was able to raise a family and carry on a very active social life.
Isn't this incredible? Absolutely incredible. This is how clever and cunning and evil our sinful nature is. This guy was the president of the local Lutheran, whatever it was. He even took a dead body into the church and tied it up and took photos of it. This is what we are trying to uncover.
Rader was in the Boy Scouts. He was a church leader. He was very well liked by people that knew him and interacted with him on a daily basis.
It was January of 1991 when Rader, now 45 years old, broke into the home of Dolores D. Davis.
You went around the room, took a few personal things. What did you do then?
Strangled her.
What did you strangle her with?
Pantyhose.
Dolores' son, Jeff, works in law enforcement. After the murder, Jeff inspected his mother's house. He found a half-eaten bowl of cereal in the sink. His mother kept her house meticulously clean. He knew she would never have gone to bed without doing the dishes. Jeff believes it was a message from BTK.
He was leaving a business card because he's saying, I'm a serial killer, see? Funny, ha-ha. That's what I think it meant.
Jeff Davis's suspicions were reinforced when BTK taunted police by leaving 2 cereal boxes with clues of his crimes. Inside were dolls simulating his murders, jewelry, and the license of one victim.
So this has gone to another level. He's deliberately taunting now. This is really, really heavy.
By 1991, BTK had murdered 10 people, and then he abruptly stopped. After interviewing his neighbors, investigators believe he had found a way to relive the thrill of his killing projects in a treehouse he built in his backyard.
His neighbors would see Dennis Rader from time to time up in that treehouse in the evening, apparently going through a scrapbook or something. And I think probably what he was doing was looking at these photographs and some of his mementos, the things he took from his victims.
And probably masturbating as well.
Personal items, jewelry, pantyhose, things such as that belong to the victim. Driver's licenses. You commit the crime once, but you relive it 1,000 times. And I think that's one of the reasons he was able to go the long periods of time in between victims.
In May of 1991, Dennis Rader found a new outlet for his extreme need to control.
He had this job of the compliance officer where he carried a gun, had a...
So humanity couldn't comply with his expectations, just probably as he couldn't comply with his father's expectations, being an ex-serviceman. So he's tried to please the father because he went into the services himself, but it still wasn't enough. And now he's got a job as a compliance person, but you can just see the demand to live to a standard that was impossible and how it's caused this man to become completely evil.
badge, was commissioned.
The dogs are somewhat territorial as well as vicious.
He was the king of Park City. He could go anywhere to do inspections. And I think maybe that satisfied his need for control, for power, for domination.
Exactly, I fully agree with that. Once he got the compliance job, then that need was being met. That evil, horrible need was being met by the power that he had over people with the position that he had now. He had that position in the church as well. So he was a man with a lot of power and a lot of influence, wasn't he? And that was a way in which he satisfied this evil that was working within him.
He's probably the most arrogant person I have ever met in my life.
He left Barbara Walters his business card with his handwriting on the back. Black and tan dog running at large. Problem. Fix hole. Call me. After that, Rader repeatedly issued Barbara citations, charging her dog Shadow had escaped from her yard.
The people, for the most part, that he really harassed as his job as a compliance officer were women.
When Rader tried to shoot her dog with a tranquilizer gun, Barbara hired a lawyer.
Then next thing you know, I receive a file full of documents in discovery preparing for the trial.
Rader had prepared 30 exhibits, all cross-referenced, along with audio and videotape.
I couldn't get out of my head that we're just here on $25 tickets, and here this guy he's prepared like we're there on a murder trial.
There we go. So there we see the extremism, the perfection, the idealism that he cannot let anything go that's punishable.
To win, he couldn't conceive of himself going to court and losing. To him, that would be a tremendous humiliation that he was going to do everything in his power to avoid.
Rader won the case and continued tormenting other residents of Park City, like Misty King. Over the course of a year and a half, Rader showed how he could wipe out a life without having to kill. Rader's torture of Misty began as soon as her boyfriend moved into her house.
Every time I did something, it was always something else. There was no complying to him. And so I asked him, I said, why will you not stop? And he goes, well, and if you just get rid of that boyfriend, that's when all your problems started.
Misty may very well have been one of Rader's targets. He later told police that he had picked out his next victim. He also said that as he got older, he wanted to make sure there were no males around when he attacked.
I got up one day and he was outside my house and he was looking in the windows. And I was like, oh my gosh, what is he looking for? Why is he always looking in my windows? And it looked like he was like videoing or taking pictures or something. And I said, what is your problem? And he goes, you know how to fix it. Get rid of him.
Misty came home and found a note on the door from Rader. He wrote that he had removed her dog Jasmine because she had escaped from her chain.
I went down to the animal shelter and they explained that Jasmine had been put to sleep.
The animal shelter said they were given an order to put the dog down.
So I left, went home, packed everything I owned, left my house. I have a lot of hatred towards him. And he runs a lot. I mean, he took a lot of things from me. He took away the home, he took away the neighbors, he took away the dog, he took away everything.
Misty King was just one of hundreds of homeowners tormented by Dennis Rader.
And that sounds very similar to Jehovah's Witnesses and other cults that if they don't get their way, they're going to take away the things that are important to the person in the use of shunning and other horrible forms of religious rules and idealisms.
For Misty and thousands of residents across Wichita, the ultimate shock was still to come. The true identity of Dennis Rader is about to be revealed. By 2004, some of the residents of Park City, Kansas, who lived on Compliance Officer Dennis Rader's beat, considered him cruel, manipulative, even downright scary. But others in his community believed he was a generous and deeply religious man, especially the congregation at Christ Lutheran Church, where
Here we go. A generous and deeply religious man. Let's follow this very carefully.
Dennis and his wife Paula worshipped.
They were active churchgoers. He was a believer, very active and in attendance.
Rader had become a prominent member of his church in the years since the last BTK murder in 1991.
So he had to climb the ladder of the church as well.
In that time, a completely new generation of Wichita residents had grown up with no memory of the terror that once gripped their city.
Because this was unknown to the young people, and it sounded too incredible to be true. There were people who lived here that knew nothing about this, and there were other people whose lives were just still guided by this.
Wichita attorney Robert Beatty believed the serial killer's story needed to be told, and began researching a book about the unsolved case. In January of 2004, the Wichita Eagle published an article about the upcoming book and its author on the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders. And then BTK reappeared. He sent the Eagle a single-page letter with a photocopy of victim Vicki Wegerle's driver's license and 3 blurry pictures of her body. After 13 years of silence, whatever forces had driven Rader to commit a series of gruesome tortures and murders now cried out for recognition.
I was hoping at the time when he came back that he came back because of remorse, because he was older, it was grief, but that's not what brought him back. You know, arrogance and ego is what brought him back. He wanted his story told.
He said that he began communicating once again because of Robert Beatty's book.
He couldn't stand somebody else getting attention, getting on the front page of the paper, the Wichita Eagle, for his work. So he came out of hiding.
Over the next 10 months, Rader sent letters, bits of crime scene evidence, postcards, even chapter headings of his own BTK story to Wichita's TV stations, police department, library, and postal boxes.
Control freak.
He wanted to demonstrate his power once again by sending in these things and his superiority over law enforcement and society.
But Dennis Rader's separate lives were on a collision course. On February 16, 2005, BTK sent what he called communication number 11 to TV station KSAS. Inside the envelope was a computer disk with a message for police. Forensic examination of computer code on the disk traced it to a computer at Rader's church, one he was known to use.
Brilliant.
Surveillance video and DNA matching also pointed to Rader.
Brilliant.
On February 25th, police made their move. Dennis Rader was arrested less than a block from his home.
There was absolutely no resistance whatsoever. He was taken into custody.
30 years and at least 10 victims after he began, Dennis Rader, the self-titled serial killer BTK, was captured.
The bottom line, BTK is arrested.
It wasn't until 3 months later that the world got its first glimpse into the mind of Dennis Rader. In June, Rader pleaded guilty to all counts. The judge then ordered him to recount the details of his crimes.
Case caption, State of Kansas.
In a flat, emotionless voice, Rader described how he strangled his victims.
Put a plastic bag over his head and then some cords, then tighten it.
And how he satisfied his perverted sexual fantasies.
I think I maybe retied her feet. What they had not already, they were probably already tied, her feet were. And at that time, masturbated, sir.
I think he enjoyed that. He could say on national television how he committed these murders. I think, if anything, he was disappointed they didn't ask him about how he got away with it.
One of the things that struck the public so dramatically was the coldness with which Dennis Rader made his confession in open court.
And let's make this very clear. Religion can make people cold. Very, very cold. In this sense that you have to put the Lord your God or Jehovah first, and if you don't do that, then it's threatening your relationship with him. And that's why people become cold, because anything that doesn't line up with their beliefs or with their idealisms or that of the organisation in which they're in, they think it's going to have a personal impact between them and their God, and so they become a passive shunner, as it were. And of course, this guy's emotionalist. They're trained not to feel anything because the Lord has everything in control.
And we can't comprehend how a person, number one, could have done those things, but number two, stand up and so coolly and so coldly describe those crimes.
I can, because Christianity can program people into thinking everything's a result of God, and you lose touch with your personal feelings and things like that, because everything evolves around God's will, nobody else's, which is a complete and utter fantasy.
And the reason we can't is because we don't operate in the same sphere of reality that people like Dennis Rader and Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy and the Son of Sam, etc., operate in.
For every question Dennis Rader has answered, many more remain.
You'll never understand it. You'll never get your mind around why he did something like that and what drove him to do it. But it does give the community as a whole, a sense of closure.
So when we encounter somebody like this, we want them to be different. So that will help explain why they're doing these things. We don't want them to look like us. And if they're the same as us, we don't understand them.
It's like the old Indian saying, there are two dogs inside of me, and which one grows the largest? The one I feed the most. So he's fed that monster all his life, and so he is a monster.
But did he feed it through his religious beliefs? Did he feed it by what he thought he needed to do or not do to make God happy or stop him from being sad? Because that can still function in a subconscious way. This man was quite successful in his own right within his personal world, but it was used, his person was also used for evil. How can a good Christian person produce such evil?
Despite the heinous nature of the killings, Dennis Rader will not face the death penalty because it was not on the books in Kansas when he committed his crimes. The question now is how long a sentence the 60-year-old killer will receive. Will he be forced to serve 10 sentences for 10 murders consecutively? Or will he be allowed to serve them concurrently? The district attorney has said she wants the longest possible sentence, 175 years without chance of parole. No sentence, of course, can ease the anguish of the victim's friends and loved ones. For them and for so many in Wichita, no punishment is enough to erase decades of uncertainty and fear, the lingering legacy of the man who will be forever remembered as the BTK killer.
So just before I go, I wanted to read this about Dennis Rader from Wikipedia. You can look it up yourself. Dennis Lynn Rader is an American serial killer known as BTK or the BTK Strangler. He gave himself the name BTK for bind, torture, kill. Between 1974 and 1991, Rader killed 10 people in Wichita, Kansas, metro area. Rader sent taunting letters to police and newspapers describing the details of his crimes, and after a decade-long hiatus, Rader resumed sending letters in 2004, leading to his 2005 arrest and subsequent guilty plea. He is serving 10 consecutive life sentences at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. Dennis Rader, as we know, though born in Pittsburgh, Kansas, he grew up in Wichita. He has 3 brothers, Paul, Bill, and Jeff. He had sexual fetishes for women's underwear and stole underpants from his victims and wore them himself. Rader spent 1966 to 1970 in the United States Air Force. Upon discharge, he moved to Park City, where he worked in the meat department of a Leakers IGA supermarket where his mother was bookkeeper. He married Paula Ditz on May 22, 1971, and they had 2 children. He attended Butler County Community College in El Dorado, earning an associate degree in electronics in 1973. He then enrolled at Wichita State University and graduated in 1979 with a bachelor's degree in administration of justice. Rader worked as assembler for the Coleman Company, an outdoor supply company. He worked at the Wichita-based office of ADT Security Services from 1974 to 1988, where he installed security alarms as part of his job, in many cases for homeowners concerned about the BTK killings. Rader was the Census Field Operations Supervisor for the Wichita area in 1989, before in 1990, Federal Census. In May 1991, he became a dog catcher and compliance officer in Park City. In this position, neighbors recall him as being sometimes overzealous and extremely strict. One neighbor complained he killed her dog for no reason. Rader was a member of Christ Lutheran Church and had been elected president of the church council. This is the part that I'm interested in. And he was also Cub Scout leader. On July 26, 2005, after Rader's arrest, his wife was granted an emergency divorce, waiving the normal waiting period. What is it that you think you need to do to make God happy or stop him from being sad outside the finished work of Christ? Because there's another law in our members warring against the law of our mind and bringing us into captivity to the law of sin and death, which is in our members. We need to be aware of this as Christians. We need to be onto this. It's not a game. It's real life. You don't want to be doing the things you don't understand. You don't want to be doing the things that you don't want to practice, the things that you hate. Do you? But sin, that it might appear sin, was producing death in me through that which is good, Paul said. The things we think we need to do or not do to make God happy or stop us from being sad will make us exceedingly sinful outside our faith in the finished work of Christ, and it's just the way God's made us. I don't want to be exceedingly sinful, do you? If I was you, I'd just leave my faith in Christ and rest on that and get on with my life. If you go beyond that, you might find yourself producing death through what is good and becoming exceedingly sinful. Let me just go down the bottom here. Paul said, O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? And this was the answer. I thank God through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Viewers, this isn't a joke. It's a very serious problem and a very serious issue that's so far overlooked. And I pray that somehow someone with a voice can take this message and look into evil that is religiously inspired. This is Dr. Jason W. Morrison, theologist, New South Wales, Australia. Bye for now. Yeah, Dr. Jason Morrison, theologist again. I just want to say thank you for watching the videos, and I hope you got plenty of self-rediscovery and freedom out of it. If you watched it on YouTube, please share or like, maybe even comment. If you watched it on Facebook, like, comment, share. But most of all, get out and live. This isn't a rehearsal. You've got a one-off life. Don't let your loyalty and your faithfulness blind you to the life that you should be experiencing. Till the next video, thank you for watching, and bye for now.